Guess we're ready to go. Okay, so first of all, Chag Sameach to everybody. Those people that are going to see this after the live presentation and see it on our website, on the Beth David website, will know that this was given during the holiday of Hanukkah for 5781. And my hope is that future talks that I give will be able to be given safely in person next year. We just found out, again, milestone today, the first patients in Ontario were treated at my hospital, University Health Network, with the new vaccine. So hopefully that will be the beginning of an avalanche of vials that will come to us and around, and we'll be able to get out of this pandemic. But it's been a pleasure to give all these talks over the last number of months. This is the second last of the series, as I'll show you. And there were a couple of times when I presented this. There was one at the Beth David about 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the technical difficulties didn't allow it to be presented the way it should. But I gave this also in April to a combination of chat students, that's our community Hebrew high school here, because they have a grade 12 course in archaeology. And it's so popular that actually last year there were 2 classes that had to be taught because they had so many students who want to take it. And their teacher, Rachel Urowitz, had heard this talk at Beth David about 3-4 years ago, actually, and asked if I would give it to her class when they reached the Second Temple period. So I put this together actually as a lecture to the students at Chat. Back in April, when the lockdown was in its early stages, I decided to offer it as well to Beth David as well as to her students. And so I gave it at that point. But this talk, actually, I've updated as I do all these talks. When I give it another time, I try to include new information. So some of the information I'm going to include, actually, I entered as recently as today. So it's up to date with a number of things that I hope will be of interest to you. And those of you that have been at my talks before will know that this is part of a series. And I hope that, again, if you want to see this, you'll be able to get it on our website in the next little bit. So I don't pretend to be an archaeologist. I'm actually not a Talmudist or a biblical scholar as such, but I just have enjoyed delving into some of the mysteries and enigmas of the Torah and try to relate the science to it. Those of you that were at the last 2 talks dealing with the hidden meanings of the words and phrases in the Tanakh, we'll find that this is a very different talk. This is more of an archaeology, historical-based talk, but I hope they'll find it interesting. And it is a detective story because of the brilliance of some of the people that I will talk about. So if you want to take a little motif from a very popular series of archaeological mystery comedy adventures in the last few decades, I just take on the moniker of Ontario Jones, and hope that you can understand what that is. I don't have any conflict of interest to report. I do have several photos and some downloads from websites that are commonly available. So, I don't expect any copyright issues, but you'll see them as we go. And so no conflict of interest, just a very strong historical interest that I always want to report. So this was the series. And it's 8 talks dealing with science and the Bible and how one can explain the other. The first 4 were given a number of weeks ago. All of these talks are now uploaded, and I want to thank my aide here, that's Cora, who's in the here on the side. Cora is our program director at Beth David, B'nai Israel Beth Am, and could not have put this together or done this or had it recorded without her. So again, I want to shout out the thanks to her. And she said she's actually enjoyed it, so hopefully she'll enjoy this one just as much. So the first four dealt with events in the early part of the Bible, and some of you may have been with me for some of those. And again, if you would like to see any of these that have been posted, you go to YouTube. It's very easy. You go to YouTube, and then you put in the search Beth David, B'nai Israel, Beth Am, and that will get you to the various talks, sermons, lectures, Divrei Torah that have been given over the last number of months. And Cora just mentioned to me tonight that she's actually put my talks together in a folder so that you'll be able to see them all at the same point. So these were the first four. The last two talks, which were given 2 weeks and 4 weeks ago, were on hidden messages in biblical Hebrew. And those two talks are also now posted. There's one coming up in January, and we'll certainly let you all know when that's going to occur. It's one that I have given a couple of times before, but I do update them like I do my other talks. And this one is about Kabbalah, geometry, and modern geography. And that's actually my favorite talk of all the ones that I put together. So if you want my favorite, this is the one. And it'll be in the middle of January. So God be willing, we'll have a chance to meet again. But today we're going to talk about the Beit Ha-Mikdash and the Aron HaKodesh, and where did they lie on the Temple Mount. And again, I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah in the year 5781. And as I mentioned in the hidden letters and meanings talk, the year is not Tafshin Pei Aleph, it's actually Hey Tafshin Pei Aleph, because there's a 5,000 in there, and the Hey is the 5,000, so that is the correct way of determining it. Just a point here about the menorah, and it relates directly to the time we're going to be discussing today. In the ancient times, the Star of David, or we call the Magen David, was not the Judaic symbol at the time. That's a more modern version, okay? In modern times, we associate the Magen David with Judaism, but the menorah was actually the Judaic symbol in ancient times. This is a tomb in Tiberias from the 2nd to 3rd centuries. You can see that it's decorated on the outside, not by a Magen David, but rather by a menorah. And notice the menorah is not the Hanukkah menorah. It's the actual menorah that matched the design of the temple menorah, which had 7 arms. Here's a tomb from Galilee from the 1st century of the Common Era. And you can see that its symbol, marking it as a Jewish grave, is with a menorah as well. And I just read about this just yesterday. This is something that I'm just adding on here, that there was a recently discovered synagogue called the Antica Synagogue in Ostia, Italy, that dates from 60 CE. This is before the destruction of the Second Temple. And you can see the menorah again on this. This is in a synagogue. This is not a gravestone. This is in the synagogue column. And they found it, and that's how they're able to identify this as a synagogue. Now, these are my sources. I give all my sources out with all my talks. Some of these references are from a Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a lay archaeology journal that has wonderful summary articles on all kinds of areas. And it goes beyond just what we call Israel now, but it goes through the Near East. And there are several articles dealing with this. So again, if you want to go back to see this talk online when it's posted, you can go back and look up these references by these different authors. Of course, we have to go to the main source, our source of richness in the Torah, in Parshat, in sort of the book of Shmot. There's also the Talmud, which gives us a lot of information about how the Second Temple, at least, was designed in Midot and Eruvin. Many ancient writers, from Yirmiyahu, Zechariah, Nehemiah, Josephus, Flavius, and Strabo, and some modern sources from Charles Warren, Benjamin Mazar, Edward Robinson, and some new information that was not in the previous talk. So again, if you were at the previous, either of the 2 times I presented this, I've got information here that was not in those. And also a wonderful YouTube video that was just posted a couple of months ago by 2 young aspiring archaeologists who visited the Temple Mount just 2 months ago. So there's two parts to this talk. I'm going to be talking about where the Beit Ha-Mikdash, or the Holy Temple, stood, and then where within that did the Holy Ark stand. So the Beit Ha-Mikdash and Ha'aron. So if you look at the sources in Shmuel Beit and in Melachim Aleph, when David was given the duty of delegating people to the area of Jerusalem as being the new capital, and his son Shlomo Solomon, who actually directed the building of the temple, the ark was brought up to, from Zion up to the temple when it was built, and it was called not the Aron Kodesh, but simply Ha'aron. So the source of the presentation, we're going to talk about ancient sources right up to modern times. The chronology, I'll show you the postulated 4 temples from the first temple on, and there's evidence for where that existed. The principle of design, again from the Mishnah Midot. Locating the second temple in 2 parts. Were there any clues to the previous, to the first temple, and where did the Holy Ark lie on there? And as you know, I like including little tidbits just to keep you alert, things that you may find interesting, little photos and so on from historical and modern times. Usually it's nice to do this in person, but I'm going to just post it if anybody can postulate what they think this actually is a photo of. Well, since I can't do it in person, this is sunrise on the surface of Mars from the Mars Land Rover. So let's go into part 1. Where is the site of the Holy Temple? A couple of preliminary comments is that from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, and this goes back to the early Middle Ages, there was actually a prohibition for Jews to walk on the Temple Mount. And the worry was that one would traverse the area of the Holy of Holies, which is sacred space. In Islamic sources, there's actually the Dome of the Rock, which was built in 690 BC by the Caliph Abd al-Malik. And it was originally called the Shrine to the Foundation Stone. And that's the large, beautiful building we'll show you that's on the Temple Mount with the gold dome. By the way, most people don't know, but the gold dome is modern. The original one was just a black surface, the original dome. The gold was put in the 20th century, so it's not from the original building. The marble is original, but the actual dome, the gold dome, is something new. So when people came to Jerusalem in the 1800s, they did not see a gold dome on there. They saw the Mizgad Omar, the Dome of the Rock, but it didn't have any gold. I don't have the exact source, but I've been trying to find it. But there is claims that Jews don't really have any jurisdiction because there's dispute as to whether the temple actually existed on the Temple Mount. This caliph, from one source that I read, and I didn't write down the actual saying that he put in, but what I remember reading was that this caliph in the 7th century said the reason that he built the Dome of the Rock and made it as beautiful as he did was to make it as beautiful as the Temple of Solomon that existed on that site. And I remember distinctly reading that, but I can't give you a source, so I don't want that to be here in the final version. But there is a more modern source that is very telling. In 1924, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and the Supreme Muslim Council of Jerusalem put out this guide called Al-Haram al-Sharif, a brief guide. In that compendium, it said its identity, that is the Dome of the Rock, its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. So even Muslims, in their original sources, as recently as 100 years ago, actually said in their sources that they agreed that Solomon's temple existed there. Further in that book, it says the stone on that stone that's within that Dome of the Rock is the stone on which David built an altar to the Lord, and it's over the stone where Abraham almost sacrificed his son. So they identify with the same Judaic historical record that we have, that is the site, they agree, is where the Temple Mount was. Now, in addition, it's interesting, those of you that have actually been at the Temple Mount and have gone under the tunnels, the tunnels that now go along the Western Wall all the way up to the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem, in Old Jerusalem. There's a little nook about 100 feet in from the area where you enter. And I remember the first time I went there, I saw some very religious young Jewish women who were praying at that nook. And it tells you that, at least within Orthodox circles, there's a notion that that nook is the closest that we can get to where the Kodesh HaKodeshim probably existed. And it made me think that, even though people say they don't know, or we're not supposed to go up there because we're not sure where the Holy of Holies was, there's still a historical memory that people in various sects within Orthodox Judaism recognize that area as being the closest area, the closest spot that is closest to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And that, why would they have that kind of feeling there? Why would they have this common thread unless they know or had a notion where it might be? And it turns out, as we'll see today, that this is probably correct, that it is very close, and it's the closest that you can get without physically being on the Temple Mount. Now, this is from an article by Lean and Kathleen Ritmeyer, who are both archaeologists, and they now are in Tucson. And there are 12 suggested locations of where the temple would be in publications from the middle of the 1800s to just a couple of decades ago. And we're going to show that only one of these actually fulfills all of the historical documents as well as those from the Talmud. Usher Kaufman, who's an archaeologist, wrote an article in this Biblical Archaeology Review, and this is his postulate of what the Temple Mount looked like and where the temple may have been. And this is the Ritmeyer's postulate from 1996, actually in several articles from 1983 from 1996. And they're going to show that these were the two most likely, but that actually only one is correct. So there are two steps to localize the temple. The first is to identify the square. The square is very clearly laid out in Mishnah Midot. It says that there was a square on which the temple was built. And that square measured 500 royal cubits by 500 royal cubits, which turns out in measurements to be 860 by 860 feet. And it's possible that this was actually the same platform dimensions for both the first and second temples, or at least it localizes both the first and second temples, as we will see. Once we know the square, then we can actually locate the building itself, because Midot actually gives you the relative dimensions of the space from the temple to the four walls of the square. So we're going to start with the square. And in order to define the square, we also have to look at the actual archaeology and the actual site itself. And this is where the Ritmeyers and Benjamin Mazar made a very important discovery about 3 decades ago. They're called the Telltale steps in the west wall of the Muslim platform that we have now out in the northwest corner of this platform. So let me show you where this is. So on the left is the diagram of the site, and on the right you can see the diagram of the actual Muslim platform. This is going north, so you'll see I can localize this for you. So the current Muslim platform is that. Now, I'm going to turn this around so that they both are oriented the same way, going north. And the Telltale steps are actually up here. And in the diagram, they're up there in the northwest corner of this platform. Now you can see that the square, as we will discover here when we put it together, is much larger. So the actual square that is defined in Midot is much larger, believe it or not, than the Muslim platform that we see today. It actually extends well beyond in all the directions except for the east side here. Okay, in the east side, there's the Kidron Valley, and the wall out here that's beyond the Muslim platform was common to both. So these are the Ritmeyers and Benjamin Mazar. And what they actually said was that in this corner, when they did their digs and way they did their analysis, and this was shortly after 1967, when Israel recaptured the city of Jerusalem and the old city, and archaeologists were allowed to visit there and to do their various analyses of the site. In that position there, and by the way, just so you have a reference point, the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, is here. This is an outer precinct built by Herod. This is a retaining wall. So the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the Western Wall, is nothing to do with the square. It's actually even beyond that out here. And that's where the prayers are held. And where I was talking about this nook is over here somewhere in that tunnel. So where you see Orthodox people praying within that tunnel is somewhere in here. And like I said, there had to be some common memory over many generations that it was close to what was probably the area most designated as the Holy of Holies. Now, I want to just mention here, there's something called the Antonia Fortress, which is up in the northwest corner here. We're going to come back to that later on, because when you're looking at the site of the temple, there's a bit of controversy as to what this fortress was. It's said to be the garrison, according to Josephus, the garrison of the Roman legion that was up on the Temple Mount at the time after Herod. And there's controversy as to whether it's this building or the entire Temple Mount itself from the time of Herod. And we'll come to that controversy later on. So that's the Antonia Fortress up in that area. And what the Ritmeyers and Benjamin Mazar found, and it's actually the whole clue to this detective story. So when we did the Akedah a number of weeks ago, I left the final step to the very end. Here, I'm giving you an answer very early on, because you have to have this detective clue, in order to define the entire Temple Mount precinct. So what they found was that right there are steps leading up to the platform, and they realized that those steps were not parallel to the Muslim platform here or to the Muslim platform border over here. So these steps are ancient. They're very, very old, thought to be back for several centuries ago. And if they are in fact a marker for the original square and were steps up to the original square, and these are known from Josephus, then it has to be parallel probably to what was the eastern wall of that square. So they're not parallel to those two, but they are parallel to those steps that are on the east side. And that gave Mazar and the Ritmeyers a clue that perhaps that is the geometry that they should be looking at, not the geometry of the current Muslim platform. So they found that the steps were not parallel to the Muslim platform, but were parallel to the east wall out here. And these are the steps that we're talking about. Now, what you may also know is that over the last number of years, the Muslim Waqf have been in charge of the proceedings up on the Temple Mount because of the Holy Mosque that's up there and the Dome of the Rock. And over the last few decades, they have cemented over and plastered over the entire Temple Mount. So there is no recognition of where landmarks may have been that were known from previous centuries. However, what they haven't abolished is the pictorial record of what people took prior to 1948. And if you look very carefully over here, you can see steps that are very ancient and which were not covered over and are still accessible. And these at the bottom here, you can see are the steps going up, but at the very bottom are very ancient steps. And these are the steps that Ritmeyers realized were not parallel. You can see they have a bit of an angle to them, and going up, they are parallel over here to the eastern side of the Temple Mount, not to the Muslim section. And you can see here, there again are the these steps. And what that allows you to do is to build a corner here and follow it to the eastern wall where there's a tower. And if you follow that, believe it or not, they are exactly 500 cubits apart. And that is the detective clue that gave them the impetus to then continue on to try and define where the square referred to in Midot might be. And prior to getting that, another little historical document for you. This is actually a shopping list. It's the first known shopping list. And you might be interested to know who actually wrote it out. I've shown this in other spots, but this is a shopping list written by the gentleman who signed his name right there. And if you look very closely, you'll see the name Michelangelo. And this was a shopping list that he gave to his aide when he was doing the Sistine Chapel, because he didn't want to have to keep coming down off the trellises. So instead he wrote this up, floated it down, and one of his servants went and got all of these items, which he actually wrote up and drew, because not everybody was literate at that time. So you can at least see the first known shopping list. So let's go on now. Here with the Ritmeyers now, we're looking for the eastern wall of the square, the eastern wall here. And to do that, you have to know some of the archaeology and the structures on the east side, which we can see now, if you can get to the east side, on the east side of the Temple Mount. There are two possible points that could mark the southern boundary of this 500 cubit east wall. So we have 500 cubits across. At this point here, there's what's called a bend in the wall. So the wall comes up and then goes off at a bit of a bend. Is that the marker for the east wall? Here, there's another architectural feature called a seam. The wall continues on, but there's a difference. There's a change in the type of stones at that point. And I'll show you what exactly that means here. So there's a seam in the east wall. Is that the marker of the 500 cubits on that side? So here we are with our 500 cubits there, just to show you on this diagram. There is the bend. Is that the 500 cubits? Here is the seam. Is that the 500 cubits? Let me show you what these two structures are. So simultaneously on the diagrams and in the pictures here, the yellow arrow is showing you the seam. This is the seam. So these are Herodian, the green. The reddish orange here is actually Macedon. This is Hashmonaim. This is from the time of the Maccabees. And north of that, we'll get to in just a moment. But this is the seam between 1st century CE and 1st century and 2nd century BCE. That's this seam. You can see that the rocks and the bricks are different. You can see the change here. And so archaeologists call this defined point the seam. So it's actually from late 1st century BCE to 1st century CE. And you can see here that this is in green, is Herodian. And on the north side, that's going north, it's changed and it's older. That's Hashmonaim. It's from the time of the Hasmoneans. So there's the seam dividing Herodian, which is 1 century later than that from the Hashmonaim. So you can see that these were added on to something that existed previously. 2nd century BCE, 1st century BCE. And there's the bend. And what's the bend? The bend is a change in the direction of that eastern wall. At that point, the wall takes a very slight northeast direction. And if you plot them far to where the north end of the current Herodian structure, the whole Temple Mount, you'll find that there's an 8-foot discrepancy between the direction from here along the seam to here along the bend. So something has changed here from the original structures. Something has changed. and this is now north of these two eras. So here's 1st century BCE, 2nd century. What is here at the original direction of that eastern wall? It turns out that it's very, very old. So here we are at the Hasmonean, that's the seam. There is the Hasmonean, and the bend is north of it here, as I show you on this diagram here. That's now north of it. And the question is, when does that date from? Well, if you look here, there's the Hasmonean. This is going north now. It's heading north. On the other side of the Hasmoneans, these stones at the base are very, very old. They actually date here along that side. Again, here we are, we're at the bend, going north towards the corner here, that first corner that they defined. It turns out that those are from the 6th century BCE. Now think about that, 6th century BCE, those original stones, that is the first temple period. The temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, but those stones date from that time, which suggests that we are looking at a temple platform that goes back not just to the 2nd temple period, but several centuries earlier, possibly to the time that Nehemiah would have had this basis, this foundation on which to build the temple. Now, here is these stones. You see, these stones are very old. Above them are more modern. They're actually Middle Ages up here, Turkish. So over in this area, going north from that bend is probably the original east wall precinct, the east wall of an original temple precinct. And we're talking about this wall here. And if we assume that this bend is the marker of this actual original Temple Mount east wall, which goes over here, which is Nehemiah, and then goes north here, this bend continues on to the north end, but these stones here, north of this point, are actually Herodian. This is construction from the 1st century BCE, not from Nehemiah. So everything from this bend to here is from the 6th century. From here north, we go back to 1st century, okay? I'm going to show you this in a summary in just a moment. So everything up to here, this is where we're talking, is 6th century now, and north of that, it changes to 1st century. So here it is, just to summarize where we're at. Here is the northeast corner. The Ritmeyers brought this wall along here as the marker of the north end of the square. From the bend and south of it, we have the 1st century Herodian. Again, 2nd century Hasmonean. 6th century BCE, this is from Nehemiah, and actually it's not Nehemiah, it's actually earlier than that. It's from the end of the 1st temple period. And then further north is a continuation of Herod's buildings here. Herod built this retaining wall out here, so his front section here and everything from here north is all 1st century BCE. So our interest is in this portion here that may actually be very original. And you can see here that if you take from the bend, assuming that this is the actual wall, from this bend to this corner is 500 cubits. So now we have the second wall. We have the second wall of this square. Now we have to look and see, can we define the south end of the square here? And before we get there, I have another little historic tidbit for you. This is somebody's office, and if you look at the equations and the physics back here, somebody who did a lot of reading and put out a lot of papers. This is at the day that Einstein passed away in 1955. That was his office at Princeton. So the final clues for the square is to look at the orientation of the double and triple gates and the Hulda gates, which come from the text in Eruvin. and the subterranean structures which were discovered by Charles Warren. So here we are again. We have reached a 500 cubit wall here. From this Nehemiah, from the base here where we had 6th century BCE bricks, this measures 500 cubits and very likely represents an original, not just second temple, but possibly first temple structure. And we have to now thank Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria sent an engineer by the name of Charles Warren, who's got a very, very well-known sites that have been designated in the Temple Mount. Some of you may know about Warren's Shaft. Warren's Shaft was discovered when during the excavations underneath the Temple Mount. And he found what's called the Tzinor, which is thought to maybe be the entry site, the cave, through which David was able to climb to get into the old original city of what was then Jerusalem, to the Jebusite city. And his name is ascribed to that passage, which is very famous and is shown in many tours of ancient Jerusalem. He found that in the south end of Herodian, this is now Herodian, but he found here in these entry gates, the double and triple gates, that if you follow them along underground, and this is where he made these contributions, he was able to go underground, which you cannot do easily anymore, but he was able to map out and actually draw out and discover and note all of the structures underneath the Temple Mount and the various cisterns. So in Midot, it actually talks about the Hulda gates through which people passed to get up to the Temple Mount. Here is one of the Hulda gates, which are directly in line with the passage from the double gate going in. You know, the double gates, these are closed, but you can see them on the south wall of the temple precinct. This is not part of the square. It's part of the Herodian southern wall of the precinct, which you see when you visit Jerusalem and look at it from what is now the excavations of the city of David. So here is the double gate passing through to the Hulda gate. So here's how the pilgrims would have come. They would have come in Herodian times through the double gates, through here to what were called the Hulda gates, which are there, to the southern wall of the Temple Mount precinct itself and the southern wall. So the Talmud tells us that there were gates here that actually allowed the pilgrims, to allow the people coming at those at the various festivals, people came up through this actual area. And that would suggest that somewhere along there, you should be able to find evidence of what was the southern wall of the original square that housed the Temple Mount. And I'll just digress for a moment, because you know that I put in some new slides here because there's been incredible developments in the archaeology of Ir David, the city of David, in Jerusalem, just south of the Temple Mount. Those of you that have been there in recent years will be able to appreciate what has been accomplished there. This is a scale model of what the southern area looked like, Ir David, including the palaces that were supposed to have existed at that time, probably from the time of David or the kings of Israel at the time. And if you look here, I'm just showing you here the southern wall. This is the Temple Mount, the southern wall with the double and the triple gates that we're talking about. So that's the city of David. And just to give you a little bit of flavor of what's going on in these excavations, just to give you a feeling of being back in Haaretz there. So in the Givati parking lot, this famous parking lot, and I remember when I visited Israel in 1970s, actually the bus that I was on that was going to take us to the Temple Mount for the tours parked up here at this parking lot. And who knew below that what would be found? But this Givati parking lot, as they've called it, is now one of the most active excavations, and many, many very interesting structures have been found here going back to Roman times. There's the north end, and this is the some of the excavations you can see. This is the wall that I just showed you in the last. This is looking north at the south end of the Temple Mount here. This is the stepped stone structure from Kathleen Kenyon, very famous archaeologist from the middle of the last century. This stepstone structure is one of many structures that have been unearthed here, and also what is thought to be part of David's palace just inside of that. Here's the city of David today, and all these excavations going on up here. You can see these new excavations just south of the Temple Mount. So the pilgrims would have gone through this passage. This is now accessible to those of us doing tours. This is the underground passage from the city of David that they took through these gates and emerged, as I said, going north through these gates into the Temple Mount area, through to the Hulda gates listed by the Talmud, and onto the Temple Mount. So you can actually see this continuous passage of where people were able to go. So here we are back at the diagram here. This is where we're talking about, coming from the city of David down here, through the gates, in those underground passages, emerging here to the Hulda gates and reaching this southern structure. And what Charles Warren actually found underground is that at this bend, not at the seam, but here at the bend, in fact, there is an underground partial wall that exists underneath. Now, I don't recall how old it is, but if we say that on this side, along the entire east side here, are 6th century BCE ashlars dating from the First Temple period, and this is now from the seam there coming across, that very well could also mark the southern border of the square that may have also marked the First Temple. And there's man-made cisterns, so we know that there was actually man-made activity here. These are not natural, and so they had to have been carved many, many centuries ago, and may have actually been there from even before the time of Herod. So the pilgrims entered here to the Hulda gates, and we now, to verify that this is actually the probable southern wall, we now have to go to a structure here as part of Herod's construction called Barclay's Gate, which is here. So there's an arch here, which is Robinson's Arch. I'll show you that in a moment. But just north of it here, you can still see the imprint of this when you visit the Western Wall, is Barclay's Gate. And Barclay's Gate entering onto the Temple Mount has to take a right-angled turn, which makes no sense archaeologically. Why would you build a gate here that immediately has to take a right angle? Well, the reason is because there's an underground wall here that prevents this from going this way. They could only direct it this way because of this wall, which verified the fact that this wall was probably the one that was marked in the southern wall of the original square. And so that will mark for us something else, because at Barclay's Gate here, just south of there, is a very important, one of the most important archaeological finds of all time around the Temple Mount. A number of decades ago, in the excavations around the Temple Mount, they found a very interesting block. This block has inscription in it that says Leveit HaTikiyah in this position here, Leveit HaTikiyah. That means, or Labait HaTikiyah. It means that this is the point, this ashlar here was from the original southwest corner when people sounded the shofar to mark the holidays and special occasions and the beginning of Shabbat. So this was found off this corner here. This is where they sounded the shofars or the horns to mark special occasions. And this was found as the place of the tikiyah that verifies it fell from this corner here. Let's go back one step. It fell from this corner here, and that corner is depicted here in this lower diagram. It fell off here, and we have that now verified that this was from the original temple precinct, the place of the tikiyah. So with all this evidence now, we can actually look at the dimension of this old wall, this ancient wall that met the western part of the wall here at this point, and this is exactly 500 cubits. So we've got three walls, the east, north, and south, verified by the Talmud, verified by archaeology, verified by the unusual construction here of Barclay's Gates, and by the fact that there is a wall. So that deep wall found by Warren, which is not, it's not above surface, so we can only see it if you can get under the Temple Mount. It marks the southern point of the wall that may have existed at least pre-Herod and possibly back as far as the First Temple period. And if you then join, you have a square. If you have a figure with a straight, and a straight, then the line joining those two from the Telltale steps to that point must be exactly the same. And in fact, it is. So this is the detective story I was talking about, that the direction of these steps gave the Ritmeyers and Benjamin Mazar the clue as to how this square was constructed. Now, I'll just digress for a second to talk about Robinson's Arch, because many of you who have visited, I think most of you have probably visited maybe many times that area, and it's always shown to us about Robinson's Arch. It's located way south of this, and it's at the west, again, like the Western Wall, connected to this side. And this is a diagram of what it looked like. Edward Robinson did his excavations back in the early 1800s, and it's at the southwest corner of the retaining wall. I'll say it again, this is a retaining wall built by Herod. This is where Robinson's Arch is, and that's what the archaeologists feel was the original porticos. Remember, there was a portico here that was part of the structure, the ancient structure on Herod's Temple Mount here. This is not part of the Temple Mount. It's part of the construction, but is not part of the Temple Mount Square, which is over here. But this is what Robinson's Arch looks like. All we have left is the imprint a few blocks from here. That's what you see there in the current state of the Temple Mount. So Robinson's Arch looked like that, came across down here, and there were steps going across, because you know there's a bit of a valley here going across. And you'll see at the Temple Mount, there's all the excavations here with all of the stores and all of the stalls and all the houses that were here. All this excavation that we saw in the last few years is all taking place down here. You can actually see these spaces here were ancient shops built into Herod's Temple Mount. So these are the subterranean structures that helped us to define that. So now we have all of the steps to define this square. If we say that there is a square of 500 by 500, immediately these three options drop out, including Usher Kaufman's postulate from 1983, because he doesn't even have a square. His diagram has a trapezoid here as the original Temple Mount of Herod at the time of either Second Temple period, but that doesn't gel with a square that the Ritmeyers put. This is still the Ritmeyers conjecture here. These other ones, these other conjectures over 150 years, all have squares, as you see. So they're still in the running. We don't know yet exactly which one is the correct one. So we've identified the square. Now where we can define where the temple sat, and now you'll be able to see that only one option is still in the running at the end of this exercise. So in Midot, it actually gives you the relative proportions of the distances from the temple itself to the four walls of the square. And that's in Midot, it's right there in there. So I'm just showing you here, this is the Muslim platform. And remember, the square is actually larger than the current Muslim platform. It's very interesting, but it is larger than that. 800, 500 cubits is a long distance. It's almost 1,000 feet in each direction. That's 300, that's 3 football fields, 3 American football fields long. So again, I'm giving you the showing this going north. I just put this on its end to show you, again, there are those steps that gave the Ritmeyers the whole clue as to how to define the square. And now to find the location of the temple, we have to use 3 clues. Again, the distance of the temple from the four walls of the square, and we know that it was longer on the south than the east, than the north, than the west. We also have to know that the height of the foundations of the temple, according to Midot, was 6 cubits. How was that designed? Well, you have to look at the rock on the top of the mountain to be able to define that, and the height of the rock that Morin actually measured in the 1800s. So the largest free space, this is from Midot, from the Talmud, was in the south. Next to it, the east, third, the area on the north, and the smallest was in the west. That's the ratios of the dimensions. It actually gives you it in specific monetary ratio, in numerical ratios. And simply by that fact, from the Talmud, a whole bunch of other designs drop out. It leaves us only this one from the early 1900s and this one from the Ritmeyers. So this just one fact knocks out all but 2 of them now. So these 3 didn't satisfy because they didn't have the square, and the other 8 or not 7 or 8 don't have the right dimensions of the temple relative to their squares. So here's the current Muslim platform. And if this is where the temple, there's only a very limited amount of localization or flexibility to define what the Talmud tells us. That has to be, so sorry, I'm going back. This is the current Dome of the Rock. And it turns out that the only place that satisfies the Talmudic dimensions is there. That gives you the largest dimension in the south, second largest in the east, third largest in the north, and least in the west. And when you take the ratios, there is really no other option for where the temple would stand. So according to Ritmeyer and Ritmeyer, this is where the temple stood. This is the current Muslim platform, and that's where their conjecture is to satisfy all the requirements, satisfy the square, and also where the rock was. The rock now becomes a very important part of the landscape here. So here on the left, I have the diagram. That's the Dome of the Rock there. That's where the Ritmeyers put the temple, and the Kodesh HaKodeshim would be here. Now, just to give you a couple of other options here, another expert by the name of David Jacobson wrote an article after the Ritmeyers in Biblical Archaeology Review. David Jacobson is an architectural expert and also archaeologist. He actually took what were known to be Roman dimensions and Roman construction of temples and platforms from the Roman times. And apparently when the Romans built platforms for temples, they had very specific geometric specifications for how this was supposed to be built. And Jacobson took those architectural principles and reasoned out on the current Temple Mount where the temple would have existed if it followed the typical Roman construction principles. And he figured that Herod would build the second temple, or put the second temple in such a way, not that he built it, but he would have put it in an array with his construction so that the temple would occupy a space that would fulfill what were Roman building principles. And he localized it to a central structure here called the Dome of the Chain. And he puts the temple right next to the Dome of the Chain, which is not too different from the Ritmeyers. However, the problem with Jacobson's, and actually the Ritmeyers in editorials and the letters to the editor actually argued against Jacobson's design for one very simple reason, and that is that it takes you away from the foundation stone, which was no longer in the center of what you expect would have been the construction of the temple, to put the Aron Kodesh in the middle of the array, as you'll see in a few minutes. So that sort of takes Jacobson's idea out. And there's also the notion that the ark rested, and this is from the Talmud, the ark rested in the Holy of Holies on the highest point on the rock. Now, where is there a rock that is the highest point here? Well, here's the square, and that is the highest point, the summit of the rock. It's the only rock in that square, the only rock that has a summit. And so this is where Warren conjectured that the temple must have been. And this again is the argument against the location from Jacobson, and brings us back to the Ritmeyers, because Jacobson's postulate is the temple would be here somewhere, and it kind of doesn't quite include this in a convenient spot, whereas Ritmeyer's actually puts this as the centerpiece of the temple. So here is the rock. You can see within the dome of the rock, here is the rock that was described, and it has a summit right here within that. And Warren said that the height of the rock is 6 cubits. In other words, from the surrounding rock here, the shoulder of the rock here, the top is 6 cubits above it. And if you look at Midot in 2 sources in the Mishnah, it says the foundations of the temple were 6 cubits high to the main floor. So from the bedrock here up to the main floor was 6 cubits. This is the only place where that could have occurred. So here we are. That was the shoulders of the rock here. And from there to what was the floor, what was created as the floor of the temple, is exactly 6 cubits, exactly as Warren measured, and exactly what Mishnah Midot tells us was the height of the floor above the shoulder of the bedrock. And so from here up to here is exactly 6 cubits. That's where the floor was created, and it exactly matches Warren's measurements, and also verifies what's in the Talmud, which means that the ark had to rest on that rock. So here we have another design here that has to drop out because it no longer satisfies all of these criteria that would put the temple over the area of that rock, where it's high enough that it has to be 6 cubits above the base shoulder of that rock. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the last survivor on this survivor course is Ritmeyer's design. Ritmeyer actually in the articles, and you're welcome when you go, if you want to see this talk again and try to find it, I give you the references for this. He actually gives us the stages of the construction of the temple, going back from those Nehemiah, those 6th century stones, where the temple's first and second probably stood. Here is the first temple until 586, verified, at least if we use the stones on the eastern wall and the stone wall that Warren found underneath. We actually can localize that square here, that there was a square at the same time here that was here on the east wall and along here, and the original first temple built by Solomon would have stood there. The second temple was built, the second temple built in the early 6th century BCE was built here on the same platform and fulfills again the requirement by Midot, by the Mishnah, that it had to be a square of 500 cubits by 500 by 500 by 500, and that this is where the temple stood. And then additions were made. There we are in the 2nd century BCE. Remember from earlier in the talk, I talk about this addition from Hashmonaim, from the Maccabean times, that brought it a little more south. And finally, the grand plan of Herod, the second temple here, and all of the retaining walls beyond, and all the construction in green beyond. And that would be the final step of the construction of the Temple Mount, from first temple right through to second temple, plus all the Maccabean and Herodian additions. I just want to tell you, this is not from my original talk, but just there is another thought, there's another conjecture based on the works of Josephus Flavius, according to a very enterprising architect by the name of Bob Cornucci. And he is he's the president of a Bible exploration society, I think based in the United States. And he has some evidence, his evidence from his reading and his conjecture is that the temple was never built. The original temple of Solomon was actually not built on the Temple Mount at all, but built in the city of David. He thought it was actually located in the city of David, which was originally called Zion, the original city of David, Zion or Zion, and his Ir David. He places it there. This is a diagram of the ancient city of what was Jerusalem. This is during Jebusite, the Jebusite times, prior to the conquering of it by David and his people. This is the lower city, and this is the upper city. This is before any temple was built, of course. But he conjectures that it was actually located here and not up here on the Temple Mount itself. He places it here. Now, why would he place it there? Well, what's conjectured is Josephus Flavius says that at the time in the Roman period, that there was a garrison stationed on the Temple Mount in the fort of Antonia. Now, the Roman legions had at least 5,000 or 6,000 men. And Cornuke's idea was that there had to be a space on the Temple Mount, according to Flavius Josephus, that actually could house an army of 6,000 men. He says that this cannot be the Antonia fortress. Okay, he says that can't be it, as we had labeled earlier. He said the only place they could have camped was on an area the size of the Temple Mount. So why would they be in a place where there's a temple? Or why would a temple have been built on that place? Or why would they have a garrison there if there was a temple with all its additional artifacts and things up there already? This is before the destruction of it. The Tanakh says that also Solomon built the temple on the site where David displaced the Jebusites. And also there's excavations under the city of David, again, new information, where they found areas of sacrifice with altars. So Cornukes and his group conjecture that there was actually no temple on the Temple Mount. And Josephus also describes that there was a 600-foot bridge from the temple to the mount. And Cornuke says that this is what that bridge would have to have been. There had to have been a 600-foot bridge from the Temple Mount to the area of the temple precinct. And he claims that this entire part up here is the Antonia fortress that Josephus is referring to, because it had to house 6,000 men if it was actually a legion. And he places the temple here, 600 feet, taking literally Josephus and putting it 600 feet south in the area that is now, we know, is the city of David. But this view is rejected by almost all scholars. And so it's a very small, limited number of people, but I put it in just so that you know that there's another counter argument. And part of the problem is that people aren't really sure if Josephus was referring to a full legion or garrison or a partial or tenth of that size of legion. So the word is not clear in what he meant. And the other thing is that all the evidence I gave you, all the other architectural evidence, the stones, the dimensions, the stone where we know in Islamic times, they actually agree that that was where the temple stood. And when you see the evidence of the Beit Tekiyah, that something, an artifact from the actual temple precinct that had fallen, tells you that that's where things were announced. And it was only announced on the area of the Temple Mount, near where the temple existed. So there's so much evidence, it really is almost incontrovertible that, even Cornuke's conjectures can all be argued against. And people have actually, not accepted his views, but I just put it as another option. So in case you hear in reading or from lectures and that, there is another contravening view. So we've come to the end of the first section, and that is the position of the temple on the Temple Mount. The last few minutes is now part 2, and part 2 is locating the ark on that Temple Mount. So I'm just showing you here, I've shown this picture a number of times, it's really neat. This is the Aurora Borealis, and this is what it looks like from above. from the International Space Station. So let's locate the place of the Holy Ark. And again, I go back to the Orthodox precaution from the Middle Ages and even recent times that we don't want to trample on the Temple Mount where the Kodesh or Kodeshim may have been, because it's sacred space and we're not supposed to venture up there. And at one point in the Middle Ages, it was a complete prohibition from even going up there. But from all this information that I'm showing you from the archaeologists, we have a very good idea of where the Beit Mikdash stood. And now I'm going to show you where the Ark actually stood. Now, it stood within the area of the Holy of Holies and within the area of the ancient temple where we've located now. And it stood on the highest point of this rock. So I'll give you again, here is the Dome of the Rock, this beautiful structure. And again, the gold here is modern. It's very modern. It's only about a century since that was actually put on. Here we are with the precinct again. The current Muslim platform, just to show you again, with the much larger square that we defined. And again, just to remind you that Charles Warren measured this space from the shoulder of the rock to here as 6 cubits, which defines where where Midot said that it actually lay. So there's where the Ritmeyers put the temple, satisfies the relative ratios again. And in the Ark, we know its dimensions from the Torah. Now going to Shemot, chapter 25 tells you the exact dimensions of the Ark. And so we have to find a spot within that area of the rock that had a spot for an Ark exactly of those dimensions. Right there somewhere, right there relative to the Holy of Holies and also relative to the current Dome of the Rock. And it turns out that you can find exactly where it lay, because there are very specific dimensions given to us in Mishnah Midot. This is a diagram I have from my Mishnahs here at home that actually shows a scale diagram of the temple precinct and the Kodesh HaKodeshim and the spot where the Ark lay. Holy of Holies is there within the temple itself, and we have to find a spot in that area. And it turns out that the Ritmeyer's placing of the temple beautifully gives the symmetry as well. Not only is it located where it satisfies all of the contingencies from Midot, it actually is in the center. The place that I'm going to show you is dead center in their conjectured place for it. Right there. And where on that rock is it located? There it is within the dimensions of what Midot tells us. Again, relative, it's not dead center in the Dome of the Rock, interestingly. It's off to one side, but it's dead center in the axis of the Ritmeyer's conjectured position, right there. And it turns out right there within the rock is a spot that is exactly the dimensions of the Ark, according to the Torah, of 1.5 by 2.5 cubits, right there. You can see actually there's a depression. It was actually chiseled out back in First Temple times. And it actually has a flat space there. And so we can take away the question marks and we can now locate the resting place of the Kodesh, of the Aron HaKodesh in the Temple Mount. So we've come to the end of this story, and we can now complete the various topics. So we've completed now where the Beit Mikdash and the Aron HaKodesh lay. And last but not least, in about a month, we can gather again and give you what actually is my favorite of all the topics, one that's going to take us through all kinds of areas of science and Kabbalah, geography, modern, ancient, you name it, and all kinds of secular and biblical history. And that'll be the Kabbalah, geometry, and modern geography. And I hope you'll be able to join me for that. But until then, I hope you have a good few weeks, a healthy few weeks. And let's hope that this vaccine will avalanche through the different hospitals to offices, and we'll all be able to get immunized and be able to get back to a more normal existence. So again, Chag Purim Sameach, and again, Cora, in her brilliance, put this talk right in the middle of Hanukkah. What better time to present this than the time of the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash and the holiday that we celebrate. And now, hopefully, when we talk about the rededication of the temple, the space on the Temple Mount, will mean that much more to you. And also, when you go to visit again, let's hope we can go to visit Israel soon, and that you'll be able to have even more rich experience seeing what's on the Temple Mount and all of the structures that are up there. So I think we'll end here. This is Hasof of this part, and I hope that this has been enlightening for you. And actually, we don't have to worry too much if you're up on the Temple Mount. Just make sure you don't go into the Dome of the Rock. Shavua Tov.